Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and lots of love to you. It's a very overcast day where I am right now, but boy is it lovely to be able to get all lovely and comfortable and cozy and share with you a really amazing story. And this story has got everything in it, so I don't think you're going to be disappointed. So before we continue with our story, and we're going to find out about a very bizarre fishing trip, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with part 2 of our story tonight. Anyway, we got talking at one point, and I invited Mr. Patton to join us for a meal one night at the cabin, where we cooked some fish over the fire pit. It was a fun evening, let me tell you, and Mr. Patton told us all about his incredible time during the Vietnam War. How brutal it had been to lose so many of his friends. He was a great conversationalist, you know. At one point during the evening he asked us if we'd been to the trout in the village, which he said was the local watering hole, or inn there, if you like. We'd been to the village, of course we had, but I guess we'd never noticed the inn before. When we told him no, we'd never been to the inn, he drew a map for us so that we could easily find it. "You must go there," he told us. "You won't regret it if you go. I've been going there for years. I know the owner and his wife reasonably well." He tapped his slightly extended belly. "They feed me well in the bar, and you can see it shows. The locals are very friendly at the inn, you know, and they serve some excellent light dinners. If you're interested in home cooking, that is. Like fish and chips, hamburgers, meatloaf, mac and cheese, then you won't be remotely disappointed in their hearty but humble fare." "I think we'll definitely give the place a try," I told him. "It sounds like it's worth a visit, and it might be nice to go and cook al fresco for a change. Mark told us that the trout opened from 5 p.m. until 12, and it was a fabulous place to have a social drink on an evening, and had an excellent reputation, as the owner's wife, Celia Wallace, ran the kitchen seamlessly, and the food she produced was simple but delicious. Mark told us to follow the road, and that the inn was on the edge of the village, so that is invariably what we did. We arrived at the trout at about 8 p.m, I think it was. By this time we were invariably starving hungry. We'd worked up quite an appetite, you see. We hadn't been fishing that day, but had gone for a leisurely walk up a recommended hiking trail, so I guess we'd worked up quite a hearty appetite. We ordered some fish and chips and macaroni cheese on the side. It was the best we'd ever eaten. The chips were so crisp, the fish fell off the bone, it was so fresh, and as for the mac and cheese, well, it was so cheesy. We enjoyed some light-hearted conversations with the locals there. They asked us how we were enjoying our fishing trip, and we told them we were having a fabulous time, although we were not exactly the best fishermen, and the only fish we'd actually caught were rather small, so we'd thrown them back into the lake. It was about 11:30 p.m. when we asked the innkeeper, a man called Lucan Wallace, the quickest way for us to return to our cabin along the lake. Lucan informed us that there was a long way back and a short way back to our fishing cabin. I remember wondering why he'd even bothered to mention the long way back, as no one in their right mind would take the long route home, surely. Not if there was a shorter option to choose. We'd planned to walk back to our cabin after enjoying a light snack at the bar, but hadn't realised we'd spend so long at the bar, as the time seemed to just melt away. Let's just say after a few drinks and playing a game of darts with some of the locals. Lucan Wallace was what I would describe as a robustly large man. He used to wrestle when he was younger, you see, and the evidence of that was pronounced, for the man had ponderous shoulders and impressive biceps that bulged from his short-sleeved T-shirt. He looked like the kind of man that would not be intimidated by very much. He told us he wouldn't recommend us take the short way back through the woods, because it was haunted. He assured us that it was far better to go back to the cabin by way of the dirt road, for although that trek was a little longer, we wouldn't be accosted by anything paranormal. When he said that, we were quite bemused and rather taken aback. "Haunted," I said to him, "but are you sure?" Luke and Wallace seemed rather surprised by our stunned reactions. Of course, I'm sure, he insisted. I've had some outer-worldly experiences in those woods myself, and believe me, I would never be seen going in there again during the night. People have seen strange light orbs there, heard disembodied screams, and some have had strange encounters with things that might not be altogether human. In the day it's fine, of course, to go into the woods, because they're benign. But when it gets dark, it's a different kettle of fish altogether. People have seen things and have had strange experiences there. Goodness gracious me, I said. Could you sort of tell us what kind of experiences you're talking about? I'd rather not go into it now, Luke and Wallace said, suddenly becoming what I considered to be a little bit cagey. Just take it from me. You don't want to take the shortcut back. Lucan then told us the long route and the short route back to the cabin. Once we had exited the inn and were out of the landlord's sight, me and Ethan looked at each other and both agreed that the short walk through the woods would take us half the time to get to the cabin. It seemed like a no-brainer to us, even if it was considered to be haunted. It was here that Ethan interjected into the conversation. Correction, for you it was a no-brainer, Nicholas, he said, but not for me. You know, Dylan, only too well what Nicholas can be like, he teased as he glanced at me. He's inclined to be a little lazy, is he not? He's always liked the shortcuts in life, and will take any opportunity to seize them. I wasn't happy about walking through the woods, let me tell you. Not in the dead of night. Not after what Luke and Wallace had told us. But let's just say Nicholas is a very good negotiator, and he reasoned with me that just because we had been told the woods were haunted didn't mean it was true. He said it was like the cemetery that was over the road from us. It's also rumoured to be haunted, but nobody knows if it's true or not. Let's just say I did think the idea of running into a ghost would be extremely unlikely, as those kind of things, well, they just don't happen to the O'Connors. I suppose it's true, Nicholas conceded. I guess if the truth be told, Ethan was more reluctant than I was to take the shortcut through the woods. But I guess I managed to persuade him and talk him round to reconsider. We both had powerful torches with us, and it was a reasonably light night, with a full moon hanging in the sky like a big pearly disk. I was enjoying the walk back from the trout. It was a pleasant evening, you see, with a cool breeze blowing against our cheeks. It was unusually light. We didn't feel intimidated or even daunted about walking back to the cabin in the dark, although I dare say we would have felt significantly more comfortable walking back earlier in the evening, and had that been the case, we'd have probably taken the long route home. We were tired and wanted to get back to the cabin as quickly as we could, so we could go straight to bed. It helped that we had a little alcohol in our system that made us a lot more confident. The walk was pleasant, very uneventful, so much so that any thoughts of anything paranormal passed us by, and we almost forgot what the landlord had warned us about. We walked through the woods rather casually, along the path, you could say, and that was when we saw what I believed was Mark Patton, the neighbour staying in the cabin opposite us, who had lost half his leg in Vietnam. I remember thinking to myself, fancy seeing him here, ahead of us on the footpath. We could see the distinctive red jacket that Mark Patton was wearing, the one he'd been wearing with us the night before, with the blue trim. I'd even asked him where he bought the jacket, as I fancied buying one for myself. He walked with a distinguished limp on his prosthetic leg, so I was certain we were seeing him. We didn't want to alarm him by shouting after him, so we thought we'd catch up with him. But the faster we walked towards him, the distance between us seemed to remain exactly the same, no matter whether we increased our speed or not. It was almost like chasing a mirage. I was surprised and somewhat bemused that Mark Patton was on the path ahead of us, but it was oddly reassuring. I mean, how bad could the woods actually be if he took the same route, because he'd probably been doing so for years. It was rather bewildering that we couldn't catch up with him, though. Ethan said that maybe we should call after him, let him know we were behind him. We shouted after him, "Mark! Mark! It's us! It's Nicholas and Ethan!" The weirdest thing is that Mark failed to respond to us in any way. We were perturbed by this, for we didn't believe he was hard of hearing. We continued along our way, believing that maybe Mark was slightly inebriated, and when you're drunk, you can sometimes lose an awareness of what's going on around you. Mark Patten continued limping along the path, and then he suddenly turned around and looked straight at us. In that moment my heart began to thunder violently in my chest, and a cold, breezy chill ran down my spine. We realized we were not seeing Mark Patten at all, but this grotesque-looking man. He seemed disfigured and very peculiar. I can't say if he was fully human or not. There was something insidiously predatory about him, maliciously evil. He had empty sockets where his eyes should have been. There were dark hollows on his pockmarked face. There was a grey translucent colour, and the skin hung off his face like a limp balloon. Despite the fact that he appeared to have no eyes, he was looking straight at us, I could tell that for sure, and smiling vindictively, almost as if he knew he had macabrely fooled us into believing he was someone else. I felt as if he had been playing some nasty game with us by impersonating our friend. All of a sudden he vanished before our very eyes, in what I would describe as a flash of light. He was gone from our sight, and I think in that moment we discerned we must have seen a ghost. We were so terrified, we started to run as fast as we could, but we heard feet pounding the ground behind us, getting closer and closer, and I was absolutely certain that this grotesque, hideous man was giving us chase. But when I turned around, nothing was there, and yet I continued to hear the thundering of feet hitting the forest floor, and the heavy breathing. The next thing I heard was a growl in my ear, and something grabbed me forcefully by the jacket and thrust me onto the ground. I felt a man's powerful arms holding me down, and I was helpless to resist, for I could not fight back. This thing, whatever it was, began to attack me. It smelt of death and decay, and it began to bite my neck really hard, with sharp incisors, so that the bites on my neck lasted for about 3 days afterwards, and looked more like canine teeth than human. I could feel the teeth digging into my flesh, as if I was being mauled by a dangerous wild animal. At the time, I obviously cried out in terror. Ethan came to my rescue. He saw I was struggling to fight off something that we couldn't see. So he picked up stones and threw them in the air, trying to fight this thing off. And then he started to recite the Lord's Prayer. And what he did appeared to work, because this thing that attacked me stopped its demonic assault on me, hissed at us, and slithered away, although we never saw it again. We managed to make our way back to the cabin as fast as we possibly could, and we didn't get a wink of sleep that night, because we were so terribly afraid of the strange ghostly apparition that we had seen. We were worried it would make an appearance again, for we could not be sure if this thing had followed us or not, and we couldn't make sense of what had happened to us. No sense at all. It had all seemed so incredibly bizarre. The following evening we went to the bar. We spoke to the landlord, Mr. Lucan Wallace. We told him what had happened to us the previous night. We told him we had taken the short route home against his salient advice, and it was on the path through the trees. We had mistaken this hideously grotesque entity for Mark Patten himself, and when the entity had turned around, the entity we assumed was Mark, we realized we weren't looking at him at all, but some hideously disfigured, grotesquely ugly man that vanished before our sight. We also told him that the entity had attacked me and bitten my neck, even though at this point we couldn't physically see him. But when he had attacked me, I could smell the rancidly repugnant scent of decomposing flesh upon his being that was vile and disgusting, so much so it made me want to gag. The landlord told us that he had warned us not to take the shortcut. He claimed the evil entity in the woods could take on many forms and shapes. He didn't believe it was altogether human, but he didn't know what it was. He said it was known by many of the locals as the shapeshifter, as many had encountered the strange entity that had deceived many and seemed to hang around the wooded area that surrounded the lake. The landlord went on to tell us about his experience with a shapeshifter that roams the wood at the dead of night and plays insidious tricks on anyone who dares to walk through the woods, and is known to launch an attack on people. Once we told the landlord our rather astonishing story, he seemed more agreeable to share his with us, and I'm glad to say he did, for his story added credibility and validation to what we had seen and experienced. I was taking a shortcut through the woods 5 years ago, he told us. I was going to pick up some fish from one of the men that regularly stays at one of the cabins along the lake. I enjoy exercise from time to time, and I'd been stuck indoors all day, so I thought I'd pick up some fish from the man in question. He was a great fisherman, you see, to sell me some trout for a low price, so I could put it on the menu and serve it at the inn to my patrons. And I was eager to accept or snatch up a good deal. I told him I'd pick up the trout for him at about 5 p.m. But it was late autumn, and it had got dark early. I had decided to get to his cabin quicker by taking the shortcut through the woods. Many of my patrons had warned me about the woods when it began to get dark, but I paid those wild rumours no heed at all, for at the time I didn't believe in anything that goes bump in the night, so to speak. I'm a big guy, so why should I worry about paradoxical things like that, or some phantom ghost called the shapeshifter? I casually strolled down the woodland path through the trees. I could see Cecilia ahead of me on the path, which was very strange. I almost stopped dead in my tracks. Something felt wrong. I knew instinctively that my wife, Cecilia, would never go walking in the woods when it got dark, because she'd be afraid to do a thing like that. It would be completely out of character for her. I was so taken aback to see her there, but never for a moment did I doubt it was her. I recognized the flowery sweatshirt she'd been wearing that morning, which was very distinctive, you see. I called after Cecilia and said, "Cecilia! Cecilia, it's me, Lucan! What are you doing here?" But she didn't acknowledge me along the footpath, which was exceedingly odd. But then I realized she was sobbing. She began to sob loudly. Something had clearly upset her. I'd never seen Celia this upset before. I began to run hastily towards my wife, but I had a similar experience to you. I couldn't seem to catch up with her, try as I might. It seemed I was always lagging behind, and when I called her, she took no notice of me. Finally, I did manage to gain some speed, and then I was behind her. So I thought she must have had some bad news and been wandering around the woods aimlessly, having lost all track of time, because when you're upset, you can do things like that. I ran up to my wife and touched her on the back, asking her what was wrong. She felt completely solid to me. The sobbing stopped, and then my wife turned around, and I was faced with this manic-looking grin. And I hasten to say, exactly what you men saw. The man with the hollow eyes that seemed to shapeshift into anything he wants. I knew I was seeing something that should not exist in our reality. He was not altogether human, I believe, but I do not know what he was. The next thing I knew, this entity began to double over with laughter. He laughed and laughed, as if he thoroughly enjoyed leading me on a wild goose chase. Thinking about that laughter now makes my skin crawl. It was demoniacal. I began to run away from this monstrous man, but he stopped me in my tracks, lunged towards me, grabbed me by the neck. I must have blacked out, because I don't remember anything at all. I woke up the following morning on that dirt road, away from the woods. Someone was standing over me and slapping my face, asking me if I was all right. A search party had been looking for me, and a passerby in their car had seen a lump lying on the side of the road and decided to check it out. I felt so bemused, let me tell you, because I didn't have a clue what I was doing on the dirt road or what had happened to me, but I'd been out for a long time, let me tell you. I did finally remember the grotesque man I'd encountered in the woods, and when I looked at my neck in the mirror, It was covered in bites. It looked like I'd been attacked by a wild dog, as those teeth marks were very discernible, and they were definitely not human. I was told by the locals that I'd obviously encountered the shapeshifter, and I was lucky to have been found, for there have been reports over the centuries of people disappearing from those woods, never to be seen again, and many believed the shapeshifter may have been responsible for their disappearances. "Good Lord," I said to Lucan Wallace, "that's an extraordinary story, and not that unsimilar to ours, although the evil entity didn't laugh at us, but he did seem to be wearing a vindictive smile, and looked as if he was enjoying himself." When Nicholas O'Connor and Ethan shared this unorthodox story with me, I didn't doubt for a second that they were telling me the truth, for I have known the O'Connors all their lives, and Nicholas finds it impossible to lie. Even when we were kids, I remember we were playing ball in the backyard, and Nicholas accidentally threw the ball through the window, and the glass shattered. When his parents asked who had done it, he admitted to it straight away, and if he had lied, he'd have got away with it, as his parents might have believed the neighbours' kids had accidentally blasted the window out, but Nicholas seemed incapable of lying. "Wow, that's an incredible story," I said. "I don't know what to say." "You do believe us, don't you?" asked Nicholas, studying me earnestly. "Of course I believe you. I've known you both for years, and I know for a fact, Nicholas, you find it impossible to lie. I must admit I'm kind of envious of the both of you. Not only did you get to go away on a fishing holiday, but you witnessed something so outlandish. I would have liked to have been witness to it, I must admit." "You should have come on the holiday with us," said Nicholas. "Too bad your parents are so damn dogmatic. But as for wishing you had an experience like that, I wouldn't wish it on anyone, Dylan, let me tell you. Do I need to remind you I was attacked by a ghost? This thing throttled me, bit me on the neck. It was malevolent, insanely evil. Believe me, you wouldn't want to have encountered this thing." "Maybe not," I agreed. "But I'd like to see a ghost. If they're real, that is. You see, my parents have conditioned me to be so narrow-minded and cynical about things, and I want to break through that paradigm, because when I'm older, I don't want to be anything like them. If my dad had heard the story you've just told me, he'd use only one word to describe it. He'd say it was all poppycock. He wouldn't believe a word of it." "Well, don't you worry, Dylan. I would never be so foolish as to tell someone like your father our story, because in my opinion, you don't throw your pearls before swine. I was even reluctant to tell you the story because I know how cynical you are. So you want to see a ghost, do you?" Nicholas asked me. "I do," I admitted. "I wouldn't like to encounter the demonic entity that crossed your path, obviously. But if ghosts are real, then I wouldn't mind seeing one." I glanced eagerly from Ethan to Nicholas. "I have a swell idea," I said. "I was wondering if we could visit the cemetery together at the bottom of our road one night. See if we can see anything. We could meet up in the middle of the night and go to the cemetery together. Oh, please, go on, say you'll do it." "The cemetery is locked at night," said Nicholas. "Need I remind you about that? If we went into the cemetery, we'd have to climb over the gates to get onto the property. Why the hell would you want to go there anyway? Even my mother says the place is foreboding, and it has an awful reputation of being haunted. The wooded area at the back is extremely ominous. People claim to have seen dark shadows in the trees there. Stuff like that. Honestly, if the truth be told, I'm not sure I'm up to having another outlandish encounter. The attack I experienced scared the bejesus out of me. I don't think I could go through something like that again." I was surprised that Ethan was looking at me somewhat sympathetically. He had been the one that had been reluctant to take a shortcut through the woods that night, to go back to their cabin on their fishing holiday, after learning that the woods were haunted. So I was somewhat bemused when he stood up for me. "Look, Nicholas, Ethan never gets to go on holiday, because his parents are super weird. And even though what happened in the woods was really horrible, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, don't you think we owe it to Dylan here to do this for him. The truth is we're unlikely to see anything anyway, and if we do, I don't think any paranormal experience we might have will equal what happened to us on our fishing trip. I very much doubt that." "You really want to go to the cemetery, do you?" Nicholas asked me, looking as if his brother's persuasive words were making him suddenly fold. All of a sudden a female voice interrupted our train of conversation. It was Mrs. O'Connor. "Why would you want to go to the cemetery, Dylan?" she asked me, coming into the recreation room with a tray laden with hot chocolate and brownies. "Sorry I overheard the tail end of your conversation. Something about the cemetery. You haven't lost a loved one recently, have you, Dylan?" she asked me, looking somewhat troubled. "No," I said, thinking fast on my feet. "It's old Mrs. Markham, you see. I was just saying she goes to visit Bob Markham's gravesite every single day. I admire her devotion to visiting his grave, that's all." Mrs. O'Connor shuddered. "I'd hate to be buried in that graveyard over the road. I'm sorry, but I would. I certainly admire dear Mrs. Markham for diligently laying flowers at the grave for her husband. But that graveyard, I hate to say this, is airily creepy, and has a haunted reputation, you know, and that doesn't surprise me in the least. Do you remember Roger Mornag, the man that used to live in the house next door to us? He lived to be 92 years old, you know. He had a good innings, let me tell you, and not a single sick day in his life. He died in his sleep, you know. It's the best way to go. But his wife died at 82 years old, and after her death he religiously went to her grave. Well, to visit the graveyard over the road, to put flowers at her grave, just like Mrs. Markham does for her late husband. I remember he told me that he regretted burying his wife, Abby, in that graveyard, or cemetery, so to speak. I think his words to me were, 'There's something not right about the place.' I asked him what he meant by that, and he said that every time he went to visit the grave, well, his wife's grave, there were times he'd hear disembodied cries coming from the woodland area at the back. And it terrified him, let me tell you. He said he only ever went to the graveyard in the day. One day he saw a woman standing over a grave and looked away for a second, and then she was gone. There was no physical way she could have just vanished from his sight so quickly. So he concluded he must have seen a ghost of some kind. So no, I don't advise anyone going to that graveyard if they can possibly help it. And certainly if you're going during the day, go with someone, for goodness sake. I do know the caretaker of the cemetery locks the gates at 5 p.m. sharp. And you don't see him for dust until the following morning. I'd put money on the fact that he's seen stuff going on in that cemetery. I asked him if he'd seen any weird stuff going on in the cemetery, because you know me, I'm naturally curious about everything. Well, he got exceedingly defensive. He said he didn't know what I was talking about, but I noticed an affrighted look in his eyes that told me he was hiding something. So I bet he's seen stuff going on there. So you believe in ghosts, do you, Mrs. O'Connor? I asked. You bet I do, Dylan, said Mrs. O'Connor. They're more things on heaven and earth, you know. I knew that both Nicholas and Ethan had not told their mother about what had happened on their fishing trip, for they believed their outlandish story would have caused their mother a great deal of upset, especially if she knew Nicholas had been attacked by the shapeshifter in the woods. I could see from our conversation that Mrs. O'Connor emphatically believed in ghosts, and her feelings about the old cemetery on the opposite side of the street were not unsimilar to my own. The place was very foreboding, which was one of the reasons I'd never visited the cemetery, even though it was incredibly close to home. I had been tempted to do so, of course, but then I'd lose my nerve. Not any more. I don't mind admitting I was thrilled about the prospect of visiting the cemetery at the dead of night. It would probably be one of the most exciting things I'd ever done in my young life. I could tell Nicholas was not remotely enamoured by the idea of visiting the spooky place. So I did appreciate he was going out of a limb for me, especially given he'd been attacked by a ghost before. Not many people would put their hand into a burning cauldron on the second time around, but Nicholas and Ethan were great sports in that regard. and I think they perfectly understood that the story they'd shared with me had unleashed in me a burgeoning fascination for all things paranormal. I was delighted that they had agreed upon this arrangement. We knew we'd have to climb over the large wrought iron gates, of course, to get into the cemetery, but at 18 years old that was no skin off our noses, for we were physically active and pretty good at gymnastics. I felt excited about this nightly soiree, and I'm glad to say that I knew that both my parents would not be remotely bothered if I went out at night, for despite their indomitable stranglehold over my young life, by the time I'd reached 18 years old, they had loosened their reins over me quite significantly. They viewed me now more as an adult than a child, so I no longer needed to abide by their strict instructions all the time, even though I still remained living under their roof. I will say that had my mother known I'd be venturing out into the graveyard at the bottom of our street at the dead of night, she'd have been less than amused, even though she didn't believe in the paranormal, and wasn't remotely superstitious. But she did understand why the old cemetery had a reputation for being haunted, as on a plethora of occasions she had remarked very casually about how creepy the place was, and over her dead body she'd never be buried in such an uncongenial place, and believe me, I could understand that. She'd say, "I don't know how old Mrs. Markham goes and visits her husband's grave every day. I do admire her for her diligence, of course, but it's something about that cemetery that just gives me the chills. Maybe it's because death is not a subject I like to think about, and every time I go past that cemetery, it reminds me of my own mortality, something I would really not focus on. When I go," she would say, "I don't want to know a thing about it." By contrast to my mother, if my father had known I was going ghost hunting with the O'Connor brothers, he'd have not been remotely concerned about my trip to the cemetery, but he would definitely have thought I'd joined the ranks of the seriously uneducated, ignorant, and completely deranged, and so I'd never have told him that a son of his was developing a curious fascination for the paranormal that had been kindled from a story that the O'Connor brothers had told me about a rather surreal fishing trip that had involved a strange encounter with a mysterious being on that rather unassuming regular Friday evening. I kept my clandestine plans for my rendezvous at the cemetery with the O'Connor brothers under wraps. I pretended to both of my parents that I was staying in that evening because I had a bit of a headache, and this was unusual for me. I would usually go out on a Friday night with the O'Connor brothers. We'd have a meal in town and then go back to their place, and I'd listen to them playing their drums as they prepared for their Saturday night rendezvous at a local bar, where they played the drums for a boy band that they had joined. I retired to bed early that night, after watching some television with my parents. Lousy television it was. It was incredibly boring. At least it sent me to sleep. I set my alarm for 12:30 and placed it on my nightstand. It was one of those Mickey Mouse alarm clocks that when it woke you up would let off a very infuriating tone that would make my ears ring. I had arranged to meet Ethan and Nicholas outside the cemetery at 1:45, and I was looking forward to our little adventure. The O'Connor brothers would walk to the cemetery, given it was only across the road from them. I had decided I would cycle there, as my house was further away, at the far end of the street, and I would get to the bottom of the road a lot quicker by way of my bicycle, which had become my reliable friend over the years, and I'd be using it later in the morning to do my newspaper round around the local neighbourhood. I do remember when my alarm clock rang in the late hours of the night, I thrust my pillow over my head to block out the intrusive interfering noise. I had been caught up in the mist of my dreams, and certainly didn't fancy getting up any more. But then I remembered about my pre-planned trip to the cemetery with the O'Connor brothers, and I also realised that I might not get another opportunity to enjoy an intrepid adventure like this again. The O'Connor brothers were agreeing to this little rendezvous on my account, more as a special favour to me, that they were unlikely to extend my way a second time. I knew I needed to grab the bull by the horns. I climbed out of bed rather reluctantly, wondering what I'd got myself into, as now the idea of going ghost hunting didn't feel like something I really wanted to do, as my bed seemed to be calling my name, begging me to return to its snug warm sheets. But I knew it was now or never. I needed to go to that cemetery. I sashayed quickly to the bathroom and threw some cold water across my face, and that seemed to bring me straight back to the land of the living. If it wasn't for that cold water on my face, I really might have returned to bed. I was incredibly exhausted and had a newspaper around the following morning, and it was important I delivered people their newspapers on time. I quickly got dressed and hurriedly sashayed down the long staircase that was so old that everything creaked and groaned under my sneakers. My father, as a professor, had never bothered to fix a thing in our house, and his obvious neglect was beginning to show. I wasn't really too worried about whether I'd wake up my parents or not, for they were known to be deep sleepers, and my father had quite the snore on him, which I heard very distinctly as I gingerly sneaked past their bedroom. Good, I thought. They rarely were sound asleep. It would probably take the living dead to wake them up. It didn't take me very long to glide out of our front door, somewhat seamlessly, without making much of a noise, although, like everything in our household, our front door rattled precariously as I opened it. I managed to extract my bicycle from our garage, and then there I was on the back of my bike, riding down the quiet street, where all the houses were cast in dark, ambiguous shadows, but the gentle, ethereal illumination of the street lights subdued the darkness significantly, while an almost full moon generously lit up the road ahead of me, splashing its asphalt surfaces into prisms of gossamer light. I did thankfully have a torch with me, as Nicholas had advised us that we come well prepared, and I had brought a powerful torch with me. It was as I was cycling down the road that my optimism appeared to have ballooned, as I pondered to myself in silent revelry what this night would ultimately bring. Would this be a rendezvous I would remember, or would I return to my bed at home uninspired, wondering why the hell I'd even bothered to get up at all? Of course, in reality, I knew very well the chances of encountering anything outer-worldly were not desperately promising. But then again, if I was to ever experience anything unorthodox, it would have to be at the cemetery at the bottom of our road, for it was a creepy, almost unholy place, with a frosty, unwelcoming energy. And if I was going to see anything at all in my young life that was remotely paradoxical, it would have to be there. Besides, it was the only place I knew about, close enough to home, that had a haunted reputation. So there we are. That is the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.